So managing the online facilitation session is a lot like running any other session that you'll do in person, only you're sitting down typically, which actually makes a bigger difference than you might imagine. I find projecting the energy into a camera is much harder to do than in a room. Perhaps that's nerves. In a room it feels a bit more nerve-wracking, doesn't it? You're standing in front of people, but you can look people in the eye, look around the room, and I think a sort of natural energy projection comes from some of that. So when I'm running an online session, I will stare directly into the camera, as I'm doing now, and that feels really awkward initially because you're looking at a screen full of faces on your Zoom screen, and there's all these faces and you're not looking at any of them. You're looking above them into the camera. But of course the big advantage is you're actually looking each of them in the eye from their perspective. So, you know, the quid pro quo of it, if you like, is it feels weird for you, but for all of them it looks like you're looking straight out of their screen at them. As I'm running any online session, I always have at least 2 screens. My setup here is with 3 screens. We've got a video coming on the setups that we use for our online sessions. I don't think you can run an online workshop as a facilitator without at least 2 screens. And that is one for the content, so that might be a whiteboard, it might be a PowerPoint presentation, and one so that you can see all of your participants' faces, so you can have at least some attempt at trying to read their energy levels and their interest and their enthusiasm. So 2 is a minimum. 3 is really good because then you can typically have another screen for messaging apps or anything else you want to do to keep in touch with people in the session. So 2 or 3 screens, really key for running a great online session. So as I'm getting going on my online session, I make sure I'm there a few minutes early, and I will normally ask the client or sponsor to do their introduction. And I really just want here to establish that it's their workshop and that they should set their aims to their team. I'm there to facilitate. I'm not there to kind of own their ultimate outcome. I'm there to help them achieve that, but they need to establish that their aim with their team. So I would always get the client, after I've welcomed everybody, I get the client to then do a few minutes on what we're here to do and welcoming everybody and telling them how excited they are about this session. Also, if you want to do an icebreaker, then this is the time to do it, straight after the client's introduction or sponsor's introduction. Now, thinking about icebreakers with online icebreakers, there are fewer options available to you than in person, but we've got some great ones and you can see our other videos on how to do those. But think about whether you need one. So I normally introduce my conferences I run by saying I don't like icebreakers, and in fact I say to people, if you contribute and get involved, I won't make you do an icebreaker. So I'm not a big fan of icebreakers for their own sake. There's 2 reasons I would use them for online sessions. One is if the group genuinely don't know each other and I want to use some sort of introduction. There's lots of good ones that can work to do that. And secondly, I might use an icebreaker if I need to introduce a different mindset. So if we're visioning, potentially looking ahead to the future, thinking about the strategy, then I might want people to start thinking a little differently, and signalling that through an online icebreaker is sometimes worth doing. But you don't need to, don't assume that you definitely have to do one. So after the icebreaker, I want to set the rules for the session. So my rules, and this is going counter to everything that anybody does online, and everything I see and read says use the hands up function if you want to come in. I think that ruins a workshop. I think it's great for a meeting in most cases where you want a bit more order and a little bit more management and governance of that session. But a workshop, I want people to interrupt. I want a flow of conversation. I want the conversation to follow with the participants where they want to take it. And there's pretty much not many tools that will stop that as much as the hands up function, where you've got this kind of delay if someone comes in later. How many times have you been in sessions? Oh, my point was about something 3 points ago. What I say to participants is come in whenever you want to. And then my job as a facilitator, if 2 or 3 people are talking at once, then I facilitate and I say, okay, let's get Amy to speak first, and then we'll come to Jackie, and then we'll come to Paul. That's how I would manage that situation, and you get a much better flowing conversation. It's very rare that I've experienced a workshop where too many people are talking at once. Here I'm talking about numbers up to about 25, 30 people. That's probably the largest online sessions I would use that with. I wouldn't have 30 people in one discussion with open mics, but it's worked really well up to that point. And I do encourage people in the rules, keep yourself on mute. That obviously helps the whole thing flow, helps me see when people come off mute that they want to talk as well, which is useful. And I have two other rules. One is cameras on. So it's really key, as we've talked about already, reading the room in an online session is the hardest thing that you lose. I think it's the biggest thing you lose as a facilitator, is really that energy, seeing who's sort of slumped in their seats, not interested. Reading that room is really tough, so cameras on is really important. And the third rule is to ask your participants to use just one messaging platform. So if you're using a whiteboard, ask them to put post-it notes and questions onto the whiteboard so everyone can see them there. It's really tough to keep up when you've got potentially people talking to you, putting post-its up and putting messages into the chat that's on the Zoom chat or the Teams chat. So try and avoid people using that. As you know, people will bend the rules all the time, and that's kind of fine, but it's very difficult as a facilitator to keep your eye on two different messaging platforms and pay any attention to the people as they're speaking. After you've done the rules, then it's your time to introduce the first session. Now this is where you will probably be about as nervous as you're ever going to be. So give clarity around that first session. Make sure that it's crystal clear what you're asking people to do. Don't make the first session too complicated, and then get out of the way. So once you've set that discussion, whether it's a discussion question you want people to in small groups in a breakout, or maybe you want post-it notes on the whiteboard around a particular problem or ideas or whatever your session's about, set it really clearly, give them a bit of a time frame for it, and then get out the way so that they can get on with it. Don't do any more questions, because then you can get drawn into the session immediately by people asking, so what kind of detail do you think we need here, Kieran? You don't want questions like that at this stage, because that gets you answering the content questions. You want them to answer that. So set the question and then get out of the way. And your job as you're facilitating any online session, indeed any session, is to keep your eye on the participants. So much harder to do via a screen, but you want to watch them. What are their energy levels like? Are they getting involved? Do they look interested, or are they wandering off doing other things? Just try and get a gauge on how your participants are engaging with that session. And you can do that all the time throughout the session, and that's why I always have at least 2 screens, 3 screens for me, so I can always see their faces and keep my watchful eye on what's going on. All sessions, particularly online sessions, there will be people that aren't contributing. And I guess on online sessions it's slightly easier to be a passenger, as you might call it, in a session, be quieter. I've got a few tips and tricks for how you can draw people into the conversation. So firstly, ask them directly. So you can call someone out, you can say, Amy, what's your thoughts on this point? Now there's a little trick to how to do that well. Firstly, if it's a longer question you want to pose, so you might say, we've been talking about these 3 or 4 points, and I'd love to know what you think about them, Amy. Or you do it this way, which is the correct way. Amy, I'm going to come to you with a question. We've been talking about these 3 or 4 points, and I'd love to get your perspective on which one of those is the most important. All I've done is signal to Amy at the beginning of that question that I'm coming to her, gives her a chance to have a think about it and not have that embarrassing moment for all of us where it's like, sorry, I was on mute, or whatever else you might say, they weren't paying attention. So put their name first. I ran a conference for 800 people one time, and it was a sort of a military for the Ministry of Defence, and one of the presenters, this 2-star general, was on the stage talking. He walked out into the audience while he was talking, just casually walked out, and then he stopped and said, what do you think about that, to this guy sat in the audience who was on his phone. Incredibly, the guy on his phone was taking notes and actually was able to give a pretty cogent and coherent response. But do you know, everyone sat up in their seats after that and paid attention. So I don't think I'm quite brave enough to do that, but it's a trick to certainly think about. Some other ways to get the quieter people engaged. So you can ask people to put post-it notes on the whiteboard with their views on something. If you've set it up in advance with each person having a different coloured post-it note, then you can easily see that people are contributing, and also they know that you can see, so you tend to get contributions from everybody. So that's a way of drawing in people that aren't happily sort of putting their hand up or interrupting, as we more importantly would like them to. So you can ask them to do that. There is a session called a pyramid brainstorm, which we might talk about in more detail in another video. But basically, that's about saying to people, write 3 post-it notes on your own of your thoughts about this point, then get together in a small group, 2 or 3 of you, and work out what are the top 3 from your group. And then you can keep doing that, and you can have, put people into larger and larger groups. And another way of getting people involved and getting people into the conversation, I've got a question. I call it forcing a response. And basically, I would ask, give a score out of 10 for how good, how bad, how far we've come, whatever. It doesn't matter what the question is. Get them to answer in a number out of 10. You can get them to write it on a post-it. You can get everybody to write an individual one, or you can get small groups to answer the question, and someone comes back with 7. Now you've got a why question to go into. So immediately you've got a conversation to have about why. Just asking the general question of how are we progressing will tend to keep the quiet people quiet. The more vocal people will happily come and tell you how we've progressed brilliantly or terribly or whatever the answer is. This way of forcing a response through a question, through a number, forces everyone to have an opinion, and you can then use that to have a great conversation, facilitate a wonderful discussions. But it's important to remember not everyone is there to contribute and lead and to be as involved. It is quite fine and legitimate to have people in your workshop who are there to listen, to understand, so that they can then perform later in the team or understand the strategic direction or whatever the subject of your session is. So all of that is perfectly fine. Not everybody needs to be contributing all the time.